The Dream Snake by Robert E. Howard. The night was strangely still. As we sat upon the wide veranda, gazing out over the broad shadowy lawns, the silence of the hour entered our spirits, and for a long while no one spoke. Then, far across the dim mountains that fringe the eastern skyline, a faint haze began to glow, and presently a great golden moon came up, making a ghostly radiance over the land and etching boldly the dark clumps of shadows that were trees. A light breeze came whispering out of the east, and the unmowed grass swayed before it in long sinuous waves, dimly visible in the moonlight, and from among the group upon the veranda there came a swift gasp, a sharp intake of breath that caused all of us to turn and gaze. Faming was leaning forward, clutching the arms of his chair, his face strange and pallid in the spectral light, a thin trickle of blood sleeping from the lip in which he had set his teeth. Amazed, we looked at him, and suddenly he jerked about with a short snarling laugh. "There's no need of gawking at me like a flock of sheep," he said irritably, and stopped short. We sat bewildered, scarcely knowing what sort of reply to make, and suddenly he burst out again. "Now I guess I'd better tell the whole thing, or you'll be going off and putting me down as a lunatic. Don't interrupt me, any of you. I want to get this thing off my mind. You all know that I'm not a very imaginative man, but there's a thing, purely a figment of imagination, that has haunted me since babyhood. A dream." He fairly cringed back in his chair as he muttered, "A dream. And God, what a dream. The first time—no, I can't remember the first time I ever dreamed it. I've been dreaming the hellish thing ever since I can remember. Now, it's this way. There is a sort of bungalow, set upon a hill in the midst of wide grasslands, not unlike this estate, but this scene is in Africa, and I am living there with a sort of servant, a Hindu. Just why I am there is never clear to my waking mind, though I am always aware of the reason in my dreams. As a man of a dream I remember my past life, a life which in no way corresponds with my waking life. But when I am awake my subconscious mind fails to transmit these impressions. However, I think that I am a fugitive from justice, and the Hindu is also a fugitive. How the bungalow came to be there I can never remember, nor do I know in what part of Africa it is, though all these things are known to my dream self. But the bungalow is a small one of a very few rooms, and is situated upon the top of the hill, as I said. There are no other hills about, and the grasslands stretch to the horizon in every direction, knee-deep in some places, waist-high in others. Now the dream always opens as I am coming up the hill, just as the sun is beginning to set. I am carrying a broken rifle, and I have been on a hunting trip. How the rifle was broken, and the full details of the trip, I clearly remember dreaming, but never upon waking. It is just as if a curtain were suddenly raised and a drama began, or just as if I were suddenly transferred to another man's body and life, remembering past years of that life, and not cognizant of any other existence. And that is the hellish part of it. As you know, most of us dreaming are at the beck of our consciousness, aware that we are dreaming. No matter how horrible the dream may become, we know that it is a dream, and thus insanity or possible death is staved off. But in this particular dream there is no such knowledge. I tell you, it is so vivid, so complete in every detail, that I wonder sometimes if that is not my real existence and this is a dream. But no, for then I should have been dead years ago. As I was saying, I came up the hill, and the first thing I am cognizant of is that out of the ordinary is a sort of track leading up the hill in an irregular way. That is, the grass is mashed down as if something heavy had been dragged over it. But I pay no especial attention to it, for I am thinking with some irritation that the broken rifle I carry is my only arm, and that now I must forego hunting until I can send for another. You see, I remember thoughts and impressions of the dream itself, of the occurrences of the dream. It is the memories that the dream I has, of that other dream existence, that I cannot remember. So, I come up the hill and enter the bungalow. The doors are open and the Hindu is not there, but the main room is in confusion. Chairs are broken, a table overturned. The Hindu's dagger is lying upon the floor, but there is no blood anywhere. Now, in my dreams, I never remember the other dreams, as sometimes one does. Always it is the first dream, the first time. I always experience the same sensations in my dreams with as vivid a force as the first time I ever dreamed. So, I am not able to understand this. The Hindu is gone, but, thus I ruminate, standing in the center of the disordered room, what did away with him? Had it been a raiding party of Negroes, they would have looted the bungalow and probably burned it. Had it been a lion, the place would have been smeared with blood. Then suddenly I remember the track I saw going up the hill, and a cold hand touches my spine, for instantly the whole thing is clear. The thing that came up from the grasslands and wrought havoc in the little bungalow could be naught else except a giant serpent, and as I think of the size of the spoor, cold sweat beads my forehead and the broken rifle shakes in my hand. Then I rush to the door in a wild panic, my only thought to make a dash for the coast. But the sun has set and dusk is stealing across the grasslands, and out there somewhere, lurking in the tall grass, is that grisly thing, that horror, God. The ejaculation broke from his lips with such feeling that all of us started, not realizing the tension we had reached. There was a second's silence, then he continued. So I bolt the doors and windows, light the lamp I have, and take my stand in the middle of the room. And I stand like a statue, waiting, listening. After a while the moon comes up and her haggard light drifts through the windows, and I stand still in the center of the room. The night is very still, something like this night. The breeze occasionally whispers through the grass, and each time I start and clench my hands until the nails bite into the flesh and the blood trickles down my wrist. And I stand there and wait and listen, but it does not come that night. The sentence came suddenly and explosively, and an involuntary sigh came from the rest, a relaxing of tension. I am determined, if I live the night through, to start for the coast early the next morning, taking my chance out there in the grim grasslands with it. But with morning I dare not. I do not know in which direction the monster went, and I dare not risk coming upon him in the open, unarmed as I am. So, as in a maze, I remain at the bungalow, and ever my eyes turn towards the sun, lurching relentlessly down the sky toward the horizon. Ah, God, if I could but halt the sun in the sky. The man was in the clutch of some terrific power. His words fairly leaped at us. Then the sun rocks down the sky, and the long gray shadows come stalking across the grasslands. Dizzy with fear, I have bolted the doors and windows and lighted the lamp long before the last faint glow of twilight fades. The light from the windows may attract the monster, but I dare not stay in the dark. And again I take my stand in the center of the room, waiting. There was a shuddersome halt. Then he continued, barely above a whisper, moistening his lips. There is no knowing how long I stand there. Time has ceased to be, and each second is an eon. Each minute is an eternity stretching into endless eternities. Thank God, but what is that? He leaned forward, the moonlight etching his face into such a mask of horrified listening that each of us shivered and flung a hasty glance over our shoulders. Not the night breeze this time, he whispered. Something makes the grasses swish-swish, as if a great long pliant weight were being dragged through them. Above the bungalow it swishes and then ceases. In front of the door, then the hinges creak. Creak. The door begins to bulge inward a small bit, then some more. The man's arms were held in front of him as if braced strongly against something, and his breath came in quick gasps. And I know I should lean against the door and hold it shut, but I do not. I cannot move. I stand there like a sheep waiting to be slaughtered, but the door holds. Again that sigh expressive of pent-up feeling. He drew a shaky hand across his brow, and all night I stand in the center of that room, as motionless as an image, except to turn slowly as the swish-swish of the grass marks the fiend's course about the house. Ever I keep my eyes in the direction of that soft, sinister sound. Sometimes it ceases for an instant or for several minutes, and then I stand scarcely breathing, for a horrible obsession has it that the serpent has in some way made entrance into the bungalow, and I start and whirl this way and that, frightfully fearful of making a noise, though I know not why, but ever with the feeling that the thing is at my back. Then the sounds commence again, and I freeze motionless. Now here is the only time that my consciousness, which guides my waking hours, ever in any way pierces the veil of dreams. I am in the dream, in no way conscious that it is a dream, but in a detached sort of way, my other mind recognizes certain facts and passes them on to my sleeping, shall I say ego? That is to say, my personality is for an instant truly dual and separate to an extent as the right and left arms are separate, while making up parts in the same entity. My dreaming mind has no cognizance of my higher mind. For the time being, the other mind is subordinated, and the subconscious mind is in full control, to such an extent that it does not even recognize the existence of the other. but the conscious mind, now sleeping, is cognizant of dim thought waves emanating from the dream mind. I know that I have not made this entirely clear, but the fact remains that I know that my mind, conscious and subconscious, is near to ruin. My obsession of fear as I stand there in my dream is that the serpent will raise itself and peer into the window at me. And I know in my dream that if this occurs, I shall go insane. And so vivid is the impression imparted to my conscious, now sleeping mind, that the thought waves stir the dim seas of sleep, and somehow I can feel my sanity rocking as my sanity rocks in my dream. Back and forth it totters and sways until the motion takes on a physical aspect, and I in my dream am swaying from side to side. Not always is the sensation the same, but I tell you, if that horror ever raises its terrible shape and leers at me, if I ever see the fearful thing in my dream, I shall become stark, wild, insane. There was a restless movement among the rest. God, but what a prospect, he muttered, to be insane and forever dreaming that same dream, night and day. But there I stand, and centuries go by, but at last a dim grey light begins to steal through the windows. The swishing dies away in the distance, and presently a red, haggard sun climbs the eastern sky. Then I turn about and gaze into a mirror, and my hair has become perfectly white. I stagger to the door and fling it wide. There is nothing in sight but a wide track leading away down the hill through the grasslands, in the opposite direction from that which I could take toward the coast. And with a shriek of maniacal laughter I dash down the hill and race across the grasslands. I raced until I drop from exhaustion, then I lie until I can stagger up and go on. All day I keep this up, with superhuman effort, spurred on by the horror behind me. And ever as I hurl myself forward on weakening legs, ever as I lie gasping for breath, I watch the sun with a terrible eagerness. How swiftly the sun travels when a man races it for life. A losing race it is, as I know when I watch the sun sinking toward the skyline and the hills which I had hoped to gain ere sundown seemingly as far away as ever. His voice was lowered, and indistinctly we leaned toward him. He was gripping the chair arms, and the blood was seeping from his lip. Then the sun sets, and the shadows come, and I stagger on and fall and rise and reel on again. And I laugh, laugh, laugh. Then I cease, for the moon comes up and throws the grasslands in ghostly and silvery relief. The light is white across the land, though the moon itself is like blood. And I look back the way I have come, and far back. All of us leaned farther toward him, our hair prickle. His voice came like a ghostly whisper. Far back. I see the grass waving. There is no breeze, but the tall grass parts and sways in the moonlight in a narrow, sinuous line, far away but nearing every instant. His voice died away. Somebody broke the ensuing stillness. And then I awake. Never yet have I seen the foul monster, but that is the dream that haunts me, and from which I have wakened, in my childhood screaming, in my manhood in cold sweat. At irregular intervals I dream it, and each time lately— He hesitated and then went on. Each time lately the thing has been getting closer, closer. The waving of the grass marks his progress, and he nears me with each dream. And when he reaches me, then— He stopped short, and then without a word rose abruptly and entered the house. The rest of us sat silent for a while, then followed him, for it was late. How long I slept I do not know, but I woke suddenly with the impression that somewhere in the house someone had laughed, long, loud, and hideously, as a maniac laughs. Starting up, wondering if I had been dreaming, I rushed from my room, just as a truly horrible shriek echoed through the house. The place was now alive with other people who had been awakened, and all of us rushing to Faming's room, whence the sound had seemed to come. Faming lay dead upon the floor, where it seemed he had fallen in some terrific struggle. There was no mark upon his, but his face was terribly distorted, as the face of a man who had been crushed by some superhuman force, such as some gigantic snake.
The Fearsome Touch of Death by Robert E. Howard. As long as midnight cloaks the earth with shadows grim and stark, God save us from the Judas kiss of a dead man in the dark. Old Adam Farrell lay dead in the house wherein he had lived alone for the last 20 years. A silent, churlish recluse. In his life he had known no friends, and only 2 men had watched his passing. Dr. Stein rose and glanced out the window into the gathering dusk. "You think you can spend the night here, then?" he asked his companion. This man, Fallred by name, assented. "Yes, certainly. I guess it's up to me." "Rather a useless and primitive custom, sitting up with the dead," commented the doctor, preparing to depart. "But I suppose in common decency we will have to bow to precedents. Maybe I can find someone who'll come over here and help you with your vigil." Fallred shrugged his shoulders. "I doubt it. Farrell wasn't known by many people. I scarce knew him myself, but I don't mind sitting up with the corpse." Dr. Stein was removing his rubber gloves, and Fallred watched the process with an interest that almost amounted to fascination. A slight involuntary shudder shook him at the memory of touching those gloves. Slick, cold, clammy things, like the touch of death. "You may get lonely tonight if I don't find anyone," the doctor remarked as he opened the door. "Not superstitious, are you?" Fallred laughed. "Scarcely. To tell the truth, from what I hear of Farrell's disposition, I'd rather be watching his corpse than have been his guest in life." The door closed, and Farrell took up his vigil. He seated himself in the only chair the room boasted, glanced casually at the formless, sheeted bulk on the bed opposite him, and began to read by the light of the dim lamp which stood on the rough table. Outside, the darkness gathered swiftly, and finally Fallred laid down his magazine to rest his eyes. He looked again at the shape which had, in life, been the form of Adam Farrell, wondering what quirk in the human nature made the sight of a corpse not only so unpleasant, but such an object of fear to many. Unthinking ignorance, seeing in dead things a reminder of death to come, he decided lazily, and began idly contemplating as to what life had held for this grim and crabbed old man, who had neither relatives nor friends, and who had seldom left the house wherein he had died. The usual tales of miser-hoarded wealth had accumulated, but Fallred felt so little interest in the whole matter that it was not even necessary for him to overcome any temptation to pry about the house for possible hidden treasure. He returned to his reading with a shrug. The task was more boresome than he had thought for. After a while he was aware that every time he looked up from his magazine and his eyes fell upon the bed with its grim occupant, he started involuntarily, as if he had, for an instant, forgotten the presence of the dead man and was unpleasantly reminded of the fact. The start was slight and instinctive, but he felt almost angered at himself. He realized for the first time the utter and deadening silence which enwrapped the house, a silence apparently shared by the night, for no sound came through the window. Adam Farrell had lived as far apart from his neighbors as possible, and there was no other house within hearing distance. Fallred shook himself as if to rid his mind of unsavory speculations, and went back to his reading. A sudden vagrant gust of wind whipped through the window, in which the light of the lamp flickered and went out suddenly. Fallred, cursing softly, groped in the darkness for matches, burning his fingers on the hot lamp chimney. He struck a match, relighted the lamp, and glancing over at the bed, got a horrible mental jolt. Adam Farrell's face stared blindly at him, the dead eyes wide and blank, framed in the gnarled gray features. Even as Fallred instinctively shuddered, his reason explained the apparent phenomenon. The sheet that covered the corpse had been carelessly thrown across the face, and the sudden puff of wind had disarranged and flung it aside. Yet there was something grisly about the thing, something fearsomely suggestive, as if, in the cloaking dark, a dead hand had flung aside the sheet, just as if the corpse were about to rise. Fallred, an imaginative man, shrugged his shoulders at these ghastly thoughts and crossed the room to replace the sheet. The dead eyes seemed to stare at him malevolently, with an evilness that transcended the dead man's churlishness in life. The workings of a vivid imagination, Fallred knew, and he recovered the grey face, shrinking as his hand chanced to touch the cold flesh, slick and clammy, the touch of death. He shuddered with a natural revulsion of the living for the dead, and went back to his chair and magazine. At last, growing sleepy, he lay down upon a couch which, by some strange whim of the original owner, formed part of the room's scant furnishings, and composed himself for slumber. He decided to leave the light burning, telling himself that it was in accordance with the usual custom of leaving lights burning for the dead, for he was not willing to admit to himself that already he was conscious of a dislike for lying in the darkness with the corpse. He dozed, awoke with a start, and looked at the sheeted form on the bed. Silence reigned over the house, and outside it was very dark. The hour was approaching midnight, with its accompanying eerie domination over the human mind. Fallred glanced again at the bed where the body lay, and found the sight of the sheeted object most repellent. A fantastic idea had birth in his mind, and grew, that beneath the sheet, the mere lifeless body had become a strange, monstrous thing, a hideous, conscious being that watched him with eyes that burned through the fabric of the cloth. The thought, a mere fantasy of course, he explained to himself by the legends of vampires, undead, ghosts, and such like, the fearsome attributes with which the living have cloaked the dead for countless ages, since primitive man first recognized in death something horrid and apart from life. Man feared death, thought Fallred, and some of his fear of death took hold on the dead, so that they too were feared, and the sight of the dead engendered grisly thoughts, gave rise to dim fears of hereditary memory, lurking back in the dark corners of the brain. At any rate, the silent, hidden thing was getting on his nerves. He thought of uncovering the face, on the principle that familiarity breeds contempt. The sight of the features, calm and still in death, would banish, he thought, all such wild conjectures as were haunting him in spite of himself. But the thought of those dead eyes staring in the lamplight was intolerable, so at last he blew out the light and lay down. This fear had been stealing upon him so insidiously and gradually that he had not been aware of its growth. With the extinguishing of the light, however, and the blotting out of the sight of the corpse, things assumed their true character and proportions, and Fallred fell asleep almost instantly, on his lips a faint smile for his previous folly. He awakened suddenly. How long he had been asleep he did not know. He sat up, his pulse pounding frantically, the cold sweat beading his forehead. He knew instantly where he was, remembered the other occupant of the room. But what had awakened him? A dream. Yes, now he remembered. A hideous dream in which the dead man had risen from the bed and stalked stiffly across the room with eyes of fire and a horrid leer frozen on his grey lips. Fallred had seemed to lie motionless, helpless. Then, as the corpse reached a gnarled and horrible hand, he had awakened. He strove to pierce the gloom, but the room was all blackness, and all without was so dark that no gleam of light came through the window. He reached a shaking hand toward the lamp, then recoiled as if from a hidden serpent. Sitting here in the dark with a fiendish corpse was bad enough, but he dared not light the lamp, for fear that his reason would be snuffed out like a candle at what he might see. Horror, stark and unreasoning, had full possession of his soul. He no longer questioned the instinctive fears that rose in him. All those legends he had heard came back to him and brought a belief in them. Death was a hideous thing, a brain-shattering horror, imbuing lifeless men with a horrid malevolence. Adam Farrell in his life had been simply a churlish but harmless man. Now he was a terror, a monster, a fiend lurking in the shadows of fear, ready to leap on mankind with talons dipped deep in death and insanity. Fallred sat there, his blood freezing, and fought out his silent battle. Faint glimmerings of reason had begun to touch his fright, when a soft, stealthy sound again froze him. He did not recognize it as the whisper of the night wind across the window-sill. His frenzied fancy knew it only as the tread of death and horror. He sprang from the couch, then stood undecided. Escape was in his mind, but he was too dazed to even try to formulate a plan of escape. Even his sense of direction was gone. Fear had so stultified his mind that he was not able to think consciously. The blackness spread in long waves about him, and its darkness and void entered into his brain. His motions, such as they were instinctive. He seemed shackled with mighty chains, and his limbs responded sluggishly, like an imbecile's. A terrible horror grew up in him and reared its grisly shape, that the dead man was behind him, was stealing upon him from the rear. He no longer thought of lighting the lamp. He no longer thought of anything. Fear filled his whole being. There was room for nothing else. He backed slowly away in the darkness, hands behind him, instinctively feeling the way. With a terrific effort, he partly shook the clinging mists of horror from him, and the cold sweat clammy upon his body, strove to orient himself. He could see nothing, but the bed was across the room in front of him. He was backing away from it. There was where the dead man was lying, according to all rules of nature. If the thing were, as he felt, behind him, then the old tales were true. Death did implant in lifeless bodies an unearthly animation, and dead men did roam the shadows to work their ghastly and evil will upon the sons of men. Then, great God! What was man but a wailing infant, lost in the night, and beset by frightful things from the black abyss and the terrible unknown voids of space and time? These conclusions he did not reach by any reasoning process. They leaped full-grown into his terror-dazed brain. He worked his way slowly backward, groping, clinging to the thought that the dead man must be in front of him. Then his back-flung hands encountered something slick, cold, and clammy, like the touch of death. A scream shook the echoes, followed by the crash of a falling body. The next morning, they who came to the house of death found 2 corpses in the room. Adam Farrell's sheeted body lay motionless upon the bed, and across the room lay the body of Falred, beneath the shelf where Dr. Stein had absent-mindedly left his gloves. Rubber gloves, slick and clammy to the touch of a hand groping in the dark, a hand of one fleeing his own fear. Rubber gloves, slick and clammy and cold, like the touch of death.
Rattle of Bones by Robert E. Howard. Landlord, ho! The shout broke the lowering silence and reverberated through the black forest with sinister echoing. This place has a forbidden aspect, mes amis. 2 men stood in front of the forest tavern. The building was low, long, and rambling, built of heavy logs. Its small windows were heavily barred, and the door was closed. Above the door its sinister sign showed faintly, a cleft skull. This door swung slowly open, and a bearded face peered out. The owner of the face stepped back and motioned his guests to enter, with a grudging gesture, it seemed. A candle gleamed on the table. A flame smoldered in the fireplace. Your names? Simon Kane, said the taller man briefly. Gaston Lamour, the other spoke curtly. But what is that to you? Strangers are few in the Black Forest, grunted the host. Bandits many. Sit at yonder table and I will bring food. The 2 men sat down with the bearing of men who have traveled far. One was a tall, gaunt man, clad in a featherless hat and somber black garments, which set off the dark pallor of his forbidding face. The other was of a different type entirely, bedecked with lace and plumes, although his finery was somewhat stained from travel. He was handsome in a bold way, and his restless eyes shifted from side to side, never still an instant. The host brought wine and food to the rough-hewn table, and then stood back in the shadows, like a somber image. His features, now receding into vagueness, now luridly sketched in the firelight as it leapt and flickered, were masked in a beard which seemed almost animal-like in thickness. A great nose curved above this beard, and two small red eyes stared unblinkingly at his guests. "Who are you?" suddenly asked the younger man. "I am the host of the Cleft Skull Tavern," sullenly replied the other. His tone seemed to challenge his questioners to ask further. "Do you have many guests?" Larmon pursued. "Few come twice," the host grunted. Kane started and glanced up straight into those small red eyes, as if he sought for some hidden meaning in the host's words. The flaming eyes seemed to dilate, then dropped suddenly before the Englishman's cold stare. "I'm for bed," said Kane abruptly, bringing his meal to a close. "I must take up my journey by daylight." "And I," added the Frenchman. "Host, show us to our chambers." Black shadows wavered on the walls as the two followed their silent host down a long, dark hall. The stocky, broad body of their guide seemed to grow and expand in the light of the small candle which he carried, throwing a long, grim shadow behind him. At a certain door he halted, indicating that they were to sleep there. They entered. The host lit a candle from the one he carried, then lurched back the way he had come. In the chamber the two men glanced at each other. The only furnishings of the room were a couple of bunks, a chair or two, and a heavy table. "Let us see if there is any way to make fast the door," said Kane. "I like not the looks of mine host." "There are racks on the door, and jamb for a bar," said Gaston, "but no bar." "We might break up the table and use its pieces for a bar," mused Kane. "Mon Dieu," said Lamour, "you are timorous, monsieur." Kane scowled. "I like not being murdered in my sleep," he answered gruffly. "My faith," the Frenchman laughed, "we are chance met. Until I overtook you on the forest road an hour before sunset, we had never seen each other." "I have seen you somewhere before," answered Kane, "though I cannot now recall where. As for the other, I assume every man is an honest fellow until he shows me he is a rogue. Moreover, I am a light sleeper, and slumber with a pistol at hand." The Frenchman laughed again. "I was wondering how monsieur would bring himself to sleep in a room with a stranger. Ha, ha! All right, Monsieur Englishman. Let us go forth and take a bar from one of the other rooms." Taking the candle with them, they went into the corridor. Utter silence reigned, and the small candle twinkled redly and evilly in the thick darkness. "Mine host hath neither guests nor servants," muttered Solomon Kane. "A strange tavern. What is the name now? These German words come not easily to me. The Cleft Skull? A bloody name, my faith." They tried the rooms next to theirs, but no bar rewarded their search. At last they came to the last room at the end of the corridor. They entered. It was furnished like the rest, except that the door was provided with a small barred opening, and fastened from the outside with a heavy bolt, which was secured at one end of the door jamb. They raised the bolt and looked in. "There should be an outer window, but there is not," muttered Kane. "Look!" The floor was stained darkly. The walls and one bunk were hacked to pieces, great splinters having been torn away. "Men have died in here," said Kane somberly. "Is yonder not a bar fixed in the wall?" "Aye, but 'tis made fast," said the Frenchman, tugging at it. A section of the wall swung back, and Gaston gave a quick exclamation. A small, secret room was revealed, and the two men bent over a grisly thing that lay upon its floor. "The skeleton of a man," said Gaston, "and behold how his bony leg is shackled to the floor. He was imprisoned here, and died." "Nay," said Cain, "the skull is cleft. Methinks mine host had a grim reason for a name of his hellish tavern. This man, like us, was no doubt a wanderer who fell into the fiend's hands." "Likely," said Gaston without interest. He was engaged in idly working the great iron ring from the skeleton's leg bone. Failing in this, he drew his sword, and with an exhibition of remarkable strength, cut the chain which joined the ring on the leg to the ring set deep in the log floor. "Why should he shackle a skeleton to the floor?" mused the Frenchman. "Mon Dieu, 'tis a waste of good chain. See, monsieur," he ironically addressed the white heap of bones, "I have freed you, and you may go where you like." "Have done." Cain's voice was deep. "No good will come of mocking the dead." "The dead should defend themselves," laughed Lamont. "Somehow I will slay the man who kills me, though his corpse climb up 40 fathoms of ocean to do it." Cain turned toward the outer door, closing the door from the secret room behind him. He liked not this talk which smacked of demonry and witchcraft, and he was in haste to face the host with the charge of his guilt. As he turned with his back to the Frenchman, he felt the touch of cold steel against his neck, and knew that a pistol muzzle was pressed close beneath the base of his brain. "Move not, monsieur." The voice was low and silky. "Move not, or I will scatter your few brains over the room." The Puritan raged inwardly, stood with his hands in the air while Lamont slipped the pistol and sword from their sheaths. "Now you can turn," said Gaston, stepping back. Kent bent a grim eye on the dapper fellow who stood bareheaded now, hat in one hand, the other hand leveling his long pistol. "Gaston the Butcher," said the Englishman soberly. "Fool that I was for trusting a Frenchman. You range far, murderer. I remember you now, with that cursed great hat off. I saw you in Calais this year agone. Aye, and now you will see me never again. What was that?" "Rats exploring yon skeleton," said Cain, watching the bandit like a hawk, waiting for a single slight waver of the black gun muzzle. The sound was of the rattle of bones. "Like enough," returned the other. "Now, Monsieur Cain, I know you carry considerable money on your person. I had thought to wait until you slept and then slay you. But the opportunity presented itself, and I took it. You trick easily." "I had little thought that I should fear a man with whom I broke bread," said Cain, a deep timbre of slow fury sounding in his voice. The bandit laughed cynically. His eyes narrowed as he began to back slowly toward the outer door. Cain's sinews tensed involuntarily. He gathered himself like a giant wolf, about to launch himself in a death leap. But Gaston's hand was like a rock, and the pistol never trembled. "We will have no death plunges after the shot," said Gaston. "Stand still, monsieur. I have seen men killed by dying men, and I wish to have distance enough between us to preclude that possibility. My faith, I will shoot, you will roar and charge, but you will die before you reach me with your bare hands. And mine host will have another skeleton in his secret niche. That is, if I do not kill him myself. The fool knows me not, nor I him. Moreover—" The Frenchman was in the doorway now, sighting along the barrel. The candle, which had been stuck in a niche on the wall, shed a weird and flickering light which did not extend past the doorway. And with a suddenness of death, from the darkness behind Gaston's back, a broad, vague form rose up, and a gleaming blade swept down. The Frenchman went to his knees like a butchered ox. His brains spilled from the cleft skull. Above him, towering the figure of the host, a wild and terrible spectacle, still holding the hanger with which he had slain the bandit. "Ho! Ho!" he roared. "Back!" Cain had leapt forward as Gaston fell, but the host thrust into his very face a long pistol which he held in his left hand. "Back!" he repeated in a tigerish roar, and Cain retreated from the menacing weapon and the insanity in the red eyes. The Englishman stood silent, his flesh crawling as he sensed a deeper, more hideous threat than the Frenchman had offered. There was something inhuman about this man, who now swayed to and fro like some great forest beast, while his mirthless laughter boomed out again. "Gaston the Butcher!" he shouted, kicking the corpse at his feet. "Ho! Ho! My fine brigand will hurt no more. I had heard of this fool who roamed the Black Forest. He wished gold, and he found death. Now your gold shall be mine, and more than gold, vengeance." "I am no foe of yours," Cain spoke calmly. "All men are my foes. Look, the marks on my wrist. See, the marks on my ankles. And deep in my back, the kiss of the knot. And deep in my brain, the wounds of the years of cold, silent cells, where I lay as punishment for a crime I never committed." The voice broke in a hideous, grotesque sob. Cain made no answer. This man was not the first he had seen whose brain was shattered amid the horrors of the terrible continental prisons. "But I escaped!" The scream rose triumphantly. "And here I make war on all men. What is that? Did Cano see a flash of fear in those hideous eyes? My sorcerer is rattling his bones," whispered the host, then laughed wildly. "Dying, he swore his very bones would weave a net of death for me. I shackled his corpse to the floor, and now, deep in the night, I hear his bare skeleton clash and rattle as he seeks to be free. And I laugh. Ho, ho! How he yearns to rise and stalk, like old King Death, along these dark corridors when I sleep, to slay me in my bed." Suddenly, the insane eyes flared hideously. "You were in that secret room, you and this dead fool. Did he talk to you?" Cain shuddered in spite of himself. Was it insanity, or did he actually hear the faint rattle of bones, as if the skeleton had moved slightly? Cain shrugged his shoulders. Rats will even tug at dusty bones. The host was laughing again. He sidled around Cain, keeping the Englishman always covered, and with his free hand opened the door. All was darkness within, so that Cain could not even see the glimmer of the bones on the floor. "All men are my foes," mumbled the host, in the incoherent manner of the insane. "Who lifted a hand to my aid when I lay for years in the vile dungeons, and for a deed never proven? Something happened to my brain then. I became as a wolf, a brother to those of the Black Forest, to which I fled when I escaped. They have feasted, my brothers, on all who lay in my tavern. All except this one, who now clashes his bones, this magician from Russia, lest he come stalking back through the night shadows, when the night is over the world, and slay me. for who may slay the dead? I stripped his bones and shackled him. His sorcery was not powerful enough to save him from me. But all men know that a dead magician is more evil than a living one. Move not, Englishman. Your bones I will leave in this secret room beside this one. The maniac was standing partly in the doorway of the secret room now, his weapon still menacing Cain. Suddenly, he seemed to topple backward and vanished in the darkness, and at the same instant, a vague gust of wind swept down the outer corridor and slammed the door behind him. The candle on the wall flickered and went out. Cain's groping hands, sweeping over the floor, found a pistol, and he straightened, facing the door, where the maniac had vanished. He stood in the utter darkness, his blood freezing, while a hideous, muffled scream came from the secret room, intermingled with the dry, grisly rattling of fleshless bones. Then fell silent. Cain found a flint and steel and lighted the candle. Then, holding it in one hand and the pistol in the other, he opened the secret door. "Great God!" he muttered, as a cold sweat formed on his body. "This thing is beyond all reason, yet with mine own eyes I have seen it. 2 vows have been kept, for Gaston the butcher swore that even in death he would avenge his slaying, and his was the hand that set yon fleshless monster free, and he—" The host of the cleft skull lay lifeless on the floor of the secret room, his bestial face set in lines of terrible fear, and deep in his broken neck were sunk the bare finger bones of the sorcerer's skeleton.
Skulls in the Stars by Robert E. Howard. He told how murderers walk the earth beneath the curse of Cain, with crimson clouds before their eyes and flames about their brain, for blood has left upon their souls its everlasting stain. Hood. There are 2 roads to Torkertown. One, the shorter and more direct route, leads across a barren upland moor, and the other, which is much longer, winds its tortuous way in and out among the hummocks and quagmires of the swamps, skirting the low hills to the east. It was a dangerous and tedious trail, so Solomon Kane halted in amazement when a breathless youth from the village he had just left overtook him and implored him for God's sake to take the swamp road. The swamp road? Kane stared at the boy. He was a tall, gaunt man, was Solomon Kane, his darkly pallid face and deep brooding eyes made more sombre by the drab puritanical garb he affected. "Yes, sir, 'tis far safer," the youngster answered his surprised exclamation. "Then the moor road must be haunted by Satan himself, for your townsman warned me against traversing the other." "Because of the quagmires, sir, that you might not see in the dark. You had better return to the village and continue your journey in the morning, sir." "Taking the swamp road?" "Yes, sir." Kane shrugged his shoulders and shook his head. "The moon rises almost as soon as twilight dies. By its light I can reach Torker town in a few hours across the moor." "Sir, you had better not. No one ever goes that way. There are no houses at all upon the moor, while in the swamp there is the house of old Ezra, who lives there all alone, since his maniac cousin Gideon wandered off and died in the swamp and was never found. And old Ezra, though a miser, would not refuse you lodging should you decide to stop until morning. Since you must go, you had better go the swamp road." Kane eyed the boy piercingly. The lad squirmed and shuffled his feet. "Since this moor road is so dour to wayfarers," said the Puritan, "why did not the villagers tell me the whole tale instead of vague mouthings?" "Men like not to talk of it, sir. We hoped that you would take the swamp road after the men advised you to, but when we watched and saw that you turned not at the forks, they sent me to run after you and beg you to reconsider." "Name of the devil!" exclaimed Kane sharply, the unaccustomed oath showing his irritation. "The swamp road and the moor road. What is it that threatens me, and why should I go miles out of my way and risk the bogs and mires?" "Sir," said the boy, dropping his voice and drawing closer, "we be simple villagers who like not to talk of such things, lest foul fortune befall us. But the moor road is a way accursed, and hath not been traversed by any of the countryside for a year or more. It is death to walk those moors by night, as hath been found by some score of unfortunates. Some foul horror haunts the way, and claims men for his victims." "So? And what is this thing like?" "No man knows. None has ever seen it and lived, but late farers have heard terrible laughter far out on the fen, and men have heard the horrid shrieks of its victims. Sir, in God's name, return to the village. There pass the night, and tomorrow take the swamp trail to Torker Town." Far back in Kane's gloomy eyes, a scintillant light had begun to glimmer, like a witch's torch glinting under fathoms of cold grey ice. His blood quickened. Adventure! The lure of life risk in battle! The thrill of breathtaking touch-and-go drama! Not that Kane recognized his sensations as such. He sincerely considered that he voiced his real feelings when he said, "These things be deeds of some power of evil. The lords of darkness have laid a curse upon this country. A strong man is needed to combat Satan and his might. Therefore I go, who have defied him many a time." "Sir," the boy began, then closed his mouth as he saw the futility of argument. He only added, "The corpses of the victims are bruised and torn, sir." He stood there at the crossroads, sighing regretfully as he watched the tall, rangy figure swinging up the road that led toward the moors. The sun was setting as Kane came over the brow of the low hill which debouched into the upland fen. Huge and blood-red it sank down beneath the sullen horizon of the moors, seeming to touch the rank grass with fire. So for a moment the watcher seemed to be gazing out across a sea of blood. Then the dark shadows came gliding from the east, the western blaze faded, and Solomon Kane struck out boldly into the gathering darkness. The road was dim from disuse, but was clearly defined. Kane went swiftly but warily, sword and pistols at hand. Stars blinked out, and night winds whispered among the grass like weeping spectres. The moon began to rise, lean and haggard, like a skull among the stars. Then, suddenly, Kane stopped short. From somewhere in front of him sounded a strange and eerie echo, or something like an echo. Again, this time louder. Kane started forward again. Were his senses deceiving him? No. Far out, there pealed a whisper of frightful laughter. And again, closer this time. No human being ever laughed like that. There was no mirth in it, only hatred and horror and soul-destroying terror. Kane halted. He was not afraid, but for the second he was almost unnerved. Then, stabbing through that awesome laughter, came the sound of a scream that was undoubtedly human. Kane started forward, increasing his gait. He cursed the elusive lights and flickering shadows which veiled the moor in the rising moon and made accurate sight impossible. The laughter continued, growing louder, as did the screams. Then sounded faintly the drum of frantic human feet. Kane broke into a run. Some human was being hunted to his death out there on the fen, and by what manner of horror God alone knew. The sound of the flying feet halted abruptly, and the screaming rose unbearably, mingled with other sounds, unnameable and hideous. Evidently the man had been overtaken, and Kane, his flesh crawling, visualized some ghastly fiend of the darkness, crouching on the back of its victim, crouching and tearing. Then the noise of a terrible and short struggle came clearly through the abysmal silence of the fen, and the footfalls began again, but stumbling and uneven. The screaming continued, but with a gasping gurgle. The sweat stood cold on Kane's forehead and body. This was heaping horror on horror in an intolerable manner. God, for a moment's clear light! The frightful drama was being enacted within a very short distance of him, to judge by the ease with which the sounds reached him. But this hellish half-light veiled all in shifting shadows, so that the moors appeared a haze of blurred illusions, and stunted trees and bushes seemed like giants. Cain shouted, striving to increase the speed of his advance. The shrieks of the unknown broke into a hideous, shrill squealing. Again there was the sound of a struggle, and then, from the shadows of the tall grass, a thing came reeling, a thing that had been once a man, a gore-covered, frightful thing that fell at Cain's feet, and writhed and grovelled, and raised its terrible face to the rising moon, and gibbered and yammered, and fell down again, and died in its own blood. The moon was up now, and the light was better. Cain bent above the body, which lay stark in its unnameable mutilation, and he shuddered. A rare thing for him, who had seen the deeds of the Spanish Inquisition and the witch-finders. Some wayfarer, he supposed. Then, like a hand of ice on his spine, he was aware that he was not alone. He looked up, his cold eyes piercing the shadows whence the dead man had staggered. He saw nothing, but he knew, he felt, that other eyes gave back his stare, terrible eyes not of this earth. He straightened and drew a pistol, waiting. The moonlight spread like a lake of pale blood over the moor, and trees and grasses took on their proper sizes. The shadows melted, and Cain saw. At first he thought it only a shadow of mist, a wisp of moor fog that swayed in the tall grass before him. He gazed. More illusion, he thought. Then the thing began to take on shape, vague and indistinct. Two hideous eyes flamed at him, eyes which held all the stark horror which has been the heritage of man since the fearful dawn ages. Eyes frightful and insane, with an insanity transcending earthly insanity. The form of the thing was misty and vague, a brain-shattering travesty on the human form, like, yet horridly unlike. The grass and bushes beyond showed clearly through it. Cain felt the blood pound in his temples, yet he was as cold as ice. How such an unstable being as that which wavered before him could harm a man in a physical way was more than he could understand. Yet the red horror at his feet gave mute testimony that the fiend could act with terrible material effect. Of one thing Cain was sure. There would be no hunting of him across the dreary moors, no screaming and fleeing to be dragged down again and again. If he must die, he would die in his tracks, his wounds in front. Now a vague and grisly mouth gaped wide, and the demoniac laughter again shrieked out, soul-shaking in its nearness. And, in the midst of that threat of doom, Cain deliberately leveled his long pistol and fired. A maniacal yell of rage and mockery answered the report, and the thing came at him like a flying sheet of smoke, long shadowy arms stretched to drag him down. Cain, moving with the dynamic speed of a famished wolf, fired the second pistol with as little effect, snatched his long rapier from its sheath, and thrust into the center of the misty attacker. The blade sang as it passed clear through, encountering no solid resistance, and Cain felt icy fingers grip his limbs, bestial talons tear his garments and the skin beneath. He dropped the useless sword and sought to grapple with his foe. It was like fighting a floating mist, a flying shadow armed with dagger-like claws. His savage blows met empty air. His lean, mighty arms, in whose grasp strong men had died, swept nothingness and clutched emptiness. Naught was solid or real, save the flaying, ape-like fingers with their crooked talons, and the crazy eyes which burned into the shuddering depths of his soul. Cain realized that he was in a desperate plight indeed. Already his garments hung in tatters, and he bled from a score of deep wounds. But he never flinched, and the thought of flight never entered his mind. He had never fled from a single foe, and had the thought occurred to him, he would have flushed with shame. He saw no help for it now, but that his form should lie there beside the fragments of the other victim. But the thought held no terrors for him. His only wish was to give as good an account of himself as possible before the end came, and if he could, to inflict some damage on his unearthly foe. There, above the dead man's torn body, man fought with demon under the pale light of the rising moon, with all the advantages with the demon, save one, and that one was enough to overcome all the others. For if abstract hate may bring into material substance a ghostly thing, may not courage, equally abstract, form a concrete weapon to combat that ghost? Cain fought with his arms and his feet and his hands, and he was aware at last that the ghost began to give back before him, that the fearful laughter changed to screams of baffled fury. For man's only weapon is courage that flinches not from the gates of hell itself, and against such not even the legions of hell can stand. Of this Cain knew nothing. He only knew that the talons which tore and rended him seemed to grow weaker and wavering, that a wild light grew and grew in the horrible eyes. And reeling and gasping, he rushed in, grappled the thing at last, and threw it. And as they tumbled about on the moor, and it writhed and lapped his limbs like a serpent of smoke, his flesh crawled, and his hair stood on end, for he began to understand its gibbering. He did not hear and comprehend as a man hears and comprehends the speech of a man, but the frightful secrets it imparted in whisperings and yammerings and screaming silences sank fingers of ice and flame into his soul, and he knew. The hut of old Ezra the miser stood by the road in the midst of the swamp, half screened by the sullen trees which grew about it. The walls were rotting, the roof crumbling, and great pallid and green fungus monsters clung to it and writhed about the doors and windows as if seeking to peer within. The trees leaned above it, and their grey branches intertwined so that it crouched in the semi-darkness like a monstrous dwarf over whose shoulder ogres leer. The road, which wound down into the swamp, among rotting stumps and rank hummocks and scummy snake-haunted pools and bogs, crawled past the hut. Many people passed that way these days, but few saw old Ezra, save a glimpse of a yellow face peering through the fungus-screened windows, itself like an ugly fungus. Old Ezra the miser partook much of the quality of the swamp, for he was gnarled and bent and sullen. His fingers were like clutching parasitic plants, and his locks hung like drab moss above eyes trained to the murk of the swamplands. His eyes were like a dead man's, yet hinted of depths abysmal and loathsome as the dead lakes of the swamplands. These eyes gleamed now at the man who stood in front of his hut. The man was tall and gaunt and dark. His face was haggard and claw-marked, and he was bandaged of arm and leg. Somewhat behind this man stood a number of villagers. "You are Ezra of the Swamp Road?"
"Aye, and what want ye of me?"
"Where is your cousin Gideon, the maniac youth who abode with you?"
"Gideon?"
"Aye."
"He wandered away into the swamp and never came back. No doubt he lost his way and was set upon by wolves, or died in a quagmire, or was struck by an adder."
"How long ago?"
"Over a year."
"Aye. Hark ye, Ezra the miser. Soon after your cousin's disappearance, a countryman, coming home across the moors, was set upon by some unknown fiend and torn to pieces, and thereafter it became death to cross those moors. First men of the countryside, then strangers who wandered over the fen fell to the clutches of the thing. Many men have died since the first one. Last night I crossed the moors and heard the flight and pursuing of another victim, a stranger who knew not the evil of the moors. Ezra the miser. It was a fearful thing, for the wretch twice broke from the fiend, terribly wounded, and each time the demon caught and dragged him down again. And at last he fell dead at my very feet, done to death in a manner that would freeze the statue of a saint." The villagers moved restlessly and murmured fearfully to each other, and old Ezra's eyes shifted furtively. Yet the somber expression of Solomon Kane never altered, and his condor-like stare seemed to transfix the miser.
Aye,
muttered old Ezra hurriedly.
a bad thing. Yet why do you tell this thing to me?
Aye, a sad thing. Hearken further, Ezra. The fiend came out of the shadows, and I fought with it over the body of its victim. Aye, how I overcame it I know not, for the battle was hard and long. But the powers of good and light were on my side, which are mightier than the powers of hell. At the last I was stronger, and it broke from me and fled, and I followed to no avail. Yet before it fled, it whispered to me a monstrous truth. Old Ezra started, stared wildly, seemed to shrink into himself.
Nay, why tell me this?
He muttered. I returned to the village and told my tale, said Kane, for I knew that now I had the power to rid the moors of its curse forever. Ezra, come with us.
Where?
Gasped the miser. To the rotting oak on the moors. Ezra reeled as though struck. He screamed incoherently and turned to flee. On the instant, at Kane's sharp order, 2 brawny villagers sprang forward and seized the miser. They twisted the dagger from his withered hand and pinioned his arms, shuddering as their fingers encountered his clammy flesh. Kane motioned them to follow, and turning, strode up the trail, followed by the villagers, who found their strength taxed to the utmost in their task of bearing their prisoner along. Through the swamp they went, and out, taking a little-used trail which led up over the low hills and out on the moors. The sun was sliding down the horizon, and old Ezra stared at it with bulging eyes, stared as if he could not gaze enough. Far out on the moors reared up the great oak tree, like a gibbet, now only a decaying shell. There Solomon Kane halted. Old Ezra writhed in his captor's grasp and made inarticulate noises. Over a year ago, said Solomon Kane, you, fearing that your insane cousin Gideon would tell men of your cruelties to him, brought him away from the swamps by the very trail by which we came, and murdered him here in the night. Ezra cringed and snarled.
You cannot prove this lie.
Kane spoke a few words to an agile villager. The youth clambered up the rotting bole of the tree, and from a crevice, high up, dragged something that fell with a clatter at the feet of the miser. Ezra went limp with a terrible shriek. The object was a man's skeleton, the skull cleft.
You! How knew you this? You are Satan!
Gibbered old Ezra. Kane folded his arms. The thing I fought last night told me this thing as we reeled in battle, and I followed it to this tree. For the fiend is Gideon's ghost. Ezra shrieked again and fought savagely. You knew, said Kane somberly. You knew what thing did these deeds. You feared the ghost of the maniac, and that is why you chose to leave his body on the fen instead of concealing it in the swamp. For you knew the ghost would haunt the place of his death. He was insane in life, and in death he did not know where to find his slayer, else he had come to you in your hut. He hates no man but you, but his mazed spirit cannot tell one man from another, and he slays all, lest he let his killer escape. Yet he will know you, and rest in peace forever after. Hate hath made of his ghost a solid thing that can rend and slay, and though he feared you terribly in life, in death he fears you not. Kane halted. He glanced at the sun. All this I had from Gideon's ghost, in his yammerings and his whisperings and his shrieking silences. Naught but your death will lay that ghost. Ezra listened in breathless silence, and Kane pronounced the words of his doom. A hard thing it is, said Kane somberly, to sentence a man to death in cold blood, and in such a manner as I have in mind. But you must die that others may live,
and God knoweth you deserve death. You shall not die by noose, bullet, or sword, but at the talons of him you slew, for naught else will satiate him." At these words Ezra's brain shattered. His knees gave way, and he fell, groveling and screaming for death, begging them to burn him at the stake, to flay him alive. Cain's face was set like death, and the villagers, the fear rousing their cruelty, bound the shrieking wretch to the oak tree, and one of them bade him make his peace with God. But Ezra made no answer, shrieking in a high, shrill voice with unbearable monotony. Then the villager would have struck the miser across the face, but Cain stayed him. "Let him make his peace with Satan, whom he is more like to meet," said the Puritan grimly. "The sun is about to set. Loose his cords so that he may work loose by dark, since it is better to meet death free and unshackled than bound like a sacrifice." As they turned to leave him, old Ezra yammered and gibbered unhuman sounds, and then fell silent, staring at the sun with terrible intensity. They walked away across the fen, and Cain flung a last look at the grotesque form bound to the tree, seeming in the uncertain light like a great fungus growing to the bole. And suddenly the miser screamed hideously, "Death! Death! There are skulls in the stars!" "Life was good to him, though he was gnarled and churlish and evil," Cain sighed. "Mayhap God has a place for such souls, where fire and sacrifice may cleanse them of their dross, as fire cleans the forest of fungus things. Yet my heart is heavy within me." "Nay, sir," one of the villagers spoke. "Ye have done but the will of God, and good alone shall come of this night's deed." "Nay," answered Cain heavily. "I know not. I know not." The sun had gone down, and night spread with amazing swiftness, as if great shadows came rushing down from unknown voids to cloak the world with hurrying darkness. Through the thick night came a weird echo, and the men halted and looked back the way they had come. Nothing could be seen. The moor was an ocean of shadows, and the tall grass about them bent in long waves before the faint wind, breaking the deathly stillness with breathless murmurings. Then, far away, the red disk of the moon rose over the fen, and for an instant a grim silhouette was etched blackly against it. A shape came flying across the face of the moon, a bent, grotesque thing, whose feet seemed scarcely to touch the earth. And close behind came a thing like a flying shadow, a nameless, shapeless horror. A moment the racing twain stood out boldly against the moon. Then they merged into one unnameable, formless mass, and vanished in the shadows. Far across the fen sounded a single shriek of terrible laughter.
The Open Window by Saki. "My aunt will be down presently, Mr. Nuttall," said a very self-possessed young lady of 15. "In the meantime, you must try and put up with me." Frampton Nuttall endeavored to say the correct something which should duly flatter the niece of the moment without unduly discounting the aunt that was to come. Privately, he doubted more than ever whether these formal visits on a succession of total strangers would do much towards helping the nerve cure which he was supposed to be undergoing. "I know how it will be," his sister had said when he was preparing to migrate to this rural retreat. "You will bury yourself down there and not speak to a living soul, and your nerves will be worse than ever from moping. I shall just give you letters of introduction to all the people I know there. Some of them, as far as I can remember, were quite nice." Frampton wondered whether Mrs. Sappleton, the lady to whom he was presenting one of the letters of introduction, came into the nice division.
"Do you know many of the people round here?" asked the niece when she judged that they had had sufficient silent communion.
Hardly a soul,
said Frampton.
My sister was staying here, at the rectory, some 4 years ago, and she gave me letters of introduction to some of the people here.
He made the last statement in a tone of distinct regret. Then you know practically nothing about my aunt? Pursued the self-possessed young lady.
Only her name and address,
admitted the caller. He was wondering whether Mrs. Sappleton was in the married or widowed state. An undefinable something about the room seemed to suggest masculine habitation. Her great tragedy happened just 3 years ago, said the child. That would be since your sister's time.
Her tragedy?
Asked Frampton. Somehow in this restful country spot, tragedy seemed out of place. You may wonder why we keep that window wide open on an October afternoon, said the niece, indicating a large French window that opened onto a lawn.
It is quite warm for the time of year,
said Frampton.
But has that window got anything to do with the tragedy?
Out through that window, 3 years ago to a day, her husband and her 2 young brothers went off for their day's shooting. They never came back. In crossing the moor to their favorite snipe shooting ground, they were all 3 engulfed in a treacherous piece of bog. It had been that dreadful wet summer, and places that were safe in other years gave way suddenly without warning. Their bodies were never recovered. That was the dreadful part of it.
Here the child's voice lost its self-possessed note and became falteringly human.
Poor aunt always thinks that they will come back some day. They and that little brown spaniel that was lost with them, and walk in at that window just as they used to do. That is why the window is kept open every evening till it is quite dusk. Poor dear aunt! She has often told me about how they went out, her husband with his white waterproof coat over his arm, and Ronnie, her youngest brother, singing, "Birdie, why do you bound?" as he always did to tease her, because she said it got on her nerves. Do you know, sometimes on still, quiet evenings like this, I almost get a creepy feeling that they will all walk in through that window.
She broke off with a little shudder.
It was a relief to Frampton when the aunt bustled into the room with a whirl of apologies for being late in making her appearance. "I hope Vera has been amusing you," she said.
"She has been very interesting,"
said Frampton. "I hope you don't mind the open window," said Mrs. Sappleton briskly. "My husband and brothers will be home directly from shooting, and they always come in this way. They've been out for snipe in the marshes today, so they'll make a fine mess over my poor carpets. So like you men folk, isn't it?" She rattled on cheerfully about the shooting, and the scarcity of birds, and the prospects for duck in the winter. To Frampton, it was all purely horrible. He made a desperate but only partially successful effort to turn the talk on to a less ghastly topic. He was conscious that his hostess was giving him only a fragment of her attention, and her eyes were constantly straying past him to the open window and the lawn beyond. It was certainly an unfortunate coincidence that he should have paid his visit on this tragic anniversary.
"The doctors agree in ordering me complete rest, an absence of mental excitement, and avoidance of anything in the nature of violent physical exercise,"
announced Frampton, who labored under the tolerably widespread delusion that total strangers and chance acquaintances are hungry for the least detail of one's ailments and infirmities, their cause and cure.
"On the matter of diet, they are not so much in agreement,"
he continued. "No," said Mrs. Sappleton, in a voice which only replaced a yawn at the last moment. Then she suddenly brightened into alert attention. but not to what Frampton was saying. "Here they are at last!" she cried. "Just in time for tea, and don't they look as if they were muddy up to the eyes?" Frampton shivered slightly and turned towards the niece with a look intended to convey sympathetic comprehension. The child was staring out through the open window with a dazed horror in her eyes. In a chill shock of nameless fear, Frampton swung round in his seat and looked in the same direction. In the deepening twilight, 3 figures were walking across the lawn towards the window. They all carried guns under their arms, and one of them was additionally burdened with a white coat hung over his shoulders. A tired brown spaniel kept close at their heels. Noiselessly they neared the house, and then a hoarse young voice chanted out of the dusk, "I said, Bertie, why do you bound?" Frampton grabbed wildly at his stick and hat. The door hall, the gravel drive, and the front gate were dimly noted stages in his headlong retreat. A cyclist coming along the road had to run into the hedge to avoid an imminent collision. "Here we are, my dear," said the bearer of the white mackintosh, coming in through the window. "Fairly muddy, but most of it's dry. Who was that who bolted out as we came up?" "A most extraordinary man, a Mr. Nuttall," said Mrs. Sappleton. "Could only talk about his illnesses, and dashed off without a word of goodbye or apology when you arrived. One would think he had seen a ghost." "I expect it was the spaniel," said the niece calmly. "He told me he had a horror of dogs. He was once hunted into a cemetery somewhere on the banks of the Ganges by a pack of pariah dogs, and had to spend the night in a newly dug grave with the creature snarling and grinning and foaming just above him, enough to make anyone lose their nerve." Romance, at short notice, was her specialty.